Hello everyone, today we talk about the 1400 Warhorse, which is an excuse to discuss a bit the ABC of certain equestrian aspects at least. We never dedicated much time to this because I'm not expert about horses, in spite of my name, and I would say that it's, however, always important to focus on certain specific, let's say acknowledgements rather than else, right? Today, the topic came out randomly is fundamentally illustrating the characteristics of an illumination from the Ellesmere Chaucer manuscript, which depicts actually a typical 14th, 15th century corsair runner in practice. That would be at the time the standard war horse of the men at arms, right? There is at least some approximation here because the destrier, that was the largest and heaviest horse, the great horse, was actually used in battle as well, but he was becoming reserved to the ultra heavy cavalry, right? And we will talk about that later. Some type of the trade were surely reserved for jousting, where that we're talking about the 15th century here. We will make actually the beginning of the 15th century because things changed throughout this century. That is a bit the one of chivalry, how we have interiorized it, especially in certain areas of the West. I mean, the 15th century men at arms, full plate armor, these enormous mounts that in certain cases actually are thought, because it's not entirely clear, and that's where the equine details there I miss mostly, but some of the largest breeds are still used today, even for example by think about the Shire horse or the police horse. Those still make the point, but at the time there is the myth that the stray was enormous, especially in height. Some people claim 18 hands at the shoulder, which doesn't actually fit the zoometric data that we have from actual horses remain, even the largest ones. Consider that some of the largest horses were actually the plow horses, and that this state that was loaded in armor, and that therefore we can measure in that regard for as the larger type of horse, because when we find that ultra heavy plate armor now developing also for these horses this time, you can think these were the strongest ones around. Wasn't that tall at all. Actually, it would have been between 15 16 hands tall. Hence, as far as I know, they're very easy to calculate in metric system, because if I say 15 hands is 152 centimeters, 16 is 162, 18 182, it goes like that. The point of the trait was, what the name, I say destrier, the trait, because you pronounce it, it comes from the French actually, and for right, which probably meant either that it was led on the right side by a valet on when it arrived on the field, because these were the largest mounts, and in general the horses were brought by these field aides on the battlefield and being mounted just a few times before the lining up, at least, and the actual maneuvers, because the horse tires itself with the night over. So consider that these beasts were to support something like between, say, an average man at arms, say 80 kilos, probably could say even more, just like for the armor, between 15 25 kilos maximum, right? So we would say 100 kilos altogether plus its own armor. So consider that at the tray weighs up to 600 kilos, right? So here we're talking about massive, muscular beasts. That's what made actually the difference, even with the coursier, right? Because the larger you are, even just in terms of muscles, and let's say the larger the strength, but also the quicker the exhaustion. That's why the average horse would have been a Corsair mostly, which was, by the way, equally expensive, right? It was just of slightly poorer quality than the Tre. The other etymology connected to the right thing is that the Tre might have been trained to lead with the right leg. It's another, we don't know really, but as we were saying before, these were were properly the largest beasts you could find in combat, and mostly used in tournaments. Why? Because in tournaments, with a joust specifically, you have this short trait after all that a horse has to accelerate on, but mostly loading all its power in that meter, and then not exhausting itself further, which is very different from what happens on a battlefield. Albeit we don't have to rule that out, because it is true that by the 15th century, the battlefields were getting ever more, in movement, in motion, because of the gradual spread of firearms and tactical or specialization. So on, the same cavalry had undergone this differentiation, right? Heavy cavalry, men-at-arms, like the ones who would mount these beasts, were in fact ever more elite, right? If we were talking about the 13th century, there were basically same differences. The Tre, the Corsair, and sometimes even other, like the Hackney, for the servants or soldiers, etc. Of course, it was the Ronçon, also the palfrey, mostly for traveling. But we'll say them in a while. But let's say that the idea of the ultra heavy cavalry with the toughest beasts is that it's also very slow, but that this is not negative in toto. Actually, it's how you would preferably lead a cavalry charge, right? These horses were all about the immediate impact it would achieve by smashing against the enemy, right? And a few people know that in medieval times, certain, let's say, charges were actually carried out at pace. Yes, because these beasts were so massive. We were saying before, 600 kilos, plus other 100, even more. We're talking about 700 kilos, that even if they smash at 20 kilometers per hour, it's an enormous impact on the enemy. Leaving aside that, here we're talking about the single animal, and that, of course, the charge happening in tens, in hundreds. So, an average, an average charge would be carried out preferably at something like 40-45 kilometers per hour. I honestly don't know whether this differed on the base of the horses, because I presume that the Tre would be able to do exactly the same thing, and yet it's mostly the speed at which you approach the enemy, and also the one you can get out there, that at that point would make the difference. So all armies historically had this kind of detrier, right? Also from ancient time, it was always like that. These massive but slow ones, and it's obvious that they were usually left in reserve. They were like the last line, the one that would be hoped in this employment of reserve and attritional warfare to eventually smash into an enemy that was exhausted from the battle. So if we look at the force that would be normally employed by one of these animals to smash into the enemy lines, it's basically, on average, the maximum force achieved by weight lifters during a clean and jerk lift. That is like the largest amount of newtons that a human being at that point can lift all of a sudden. Well, that horse was normally capable of achieving that, right, without too much effort. So this tells you the idea of the sheer mass of these beasts, that as a characteristic naturally had to have the larger, muscles, but also properly the shoulders and neck, right, because they had to oxygenate faster for this enormous amount of muscles they had. and that was the main deal, right? That's properly the point. But the corsair would be more practical in many ways. Consider that by the 15th century, the same knights start becoming kind of institutionalized as such. Before, knights were, even the knightly class would be somewhat open. There were more and with more mixed background. By the 15th century, you have mostly this ultra heavy guy that is usually a nobleman with great assets, etc. So this guy would have multiple horses, more than one detrite for sure, several horses at once, plus all the servants, the aides. So it was like an entire almost arm system on the march. Before it wasn't like that. It usually had like 2-3 horses all together on the battlefield for single knight, and the majority were substantially lighter. So I don't know whether actually by the 15th century it would have been more common than before, than seeing a detrite in battle when the ultra heavy cavalry was actually involved. Yet, as we were saying before, these detrite were actually tall as much as the corsairs, right? There is no evidence that there is any difference for that. Even just iconographic sources always tell us pretty standard in Europe that horses were tall just as, the shoulder of, their shoulder would be the same height of the rider one, standing in front, in front of them. And for this reason, the main difference was really the training, the amount of muscles, and in this sense, the detrite were famously only stallions that weren't castrated, of course, because that would make them more aggressive. And in fact, when we think of these horses, you have always to bear in mind that they were very aggressive, like with their hooves, with their heads, would actually punch and kick and bite in a ferocious way. The horse is a dramatically intelligent animal, and especially at that point, he understands what he's doing, right? He protects his own rider. And of course, in cavalry, there is this chemical, let's say, bond between the rider and the horse. You don't have a good cavalry if you have, let's say, a good rider and a bad horse, or vice versa. But especially if there is not this trust, love relation between the rider and the horse. They know what they're doing, so they know they must rely on each other. And literature is full of examples of this blind devotion for one another in battle. They were very aggressive, right? Even with the other horses, with men, right? And they could fight furiously in this regard. Also, another important aspect that is often overlooked is that horses are actually meant to smash against an enemy formation. Some people say, oh, well, it's not true because cavalry units would mostly, tend to avoid one another. This is true up to a certain point. Like, old military history shows us that cavalry clashed frontally at the highest speeds with broken bones, all you can imagine, on a regular base. The clash of the cuirassiers at the Battle of Austerlitz was less at kilometers of distance. It happens normally. What happens is that usually, however, these charges are mostly meant to have a psychological effect before than actually physical one, as most things in warfare. So cavalry charges, for example, even just an infantry line were carried out multiple times, not immediately at the full charge because of the wall formation. The line was tested. There were feints. There were knights going back and forth individually. Then eventually, just the wall formation would charge in the weakest spot. But that by that point, different units would have already softened up each other's ranks. So maybe these guys would break even before cavalry actually impacted on them. That happened because naturally cavalry was meant to smash into the enemy ranks. It is mostly the rider that prevents from that to happening, because horses, and especially these most aggressive ones, are actually meant to do that. Like we see it even in in breedings, like when they are in fences. Like sometimes horses do something that appears stupid, like smashing into the fence by themselves and breaking some bone, right? That does happen, and horses do charge straight. Not all of them do that. That's when you need the most aggressive, the most violent-minded ones. But it does surely happen. And that, of course, also depends dramatically on the, which makes a difference on the battlefield, on the cohesion of the formations. That is mostly due to a moral capacity in practice. But yes, horses, and especially these ones, the most aggressive, the beefiest ones, would actually were selected among the ones that would actually smash physically even into something that would kill them, because at the end of the day, that's also what the enemy was trying to do. And there would be very interesting things to point out, even the differences between tournaments and battlefield, because at this point, tournaments were becoming regulated also to kind of spare the life of those who participated into them. For example, the fence in between would, create this inclination 25 degrees and not smash, it would prevent, first of all, the two horses not colliding, which instead does happen. That was the reason and the proof that happened in the first place when the fence was introduced. But also would make the lance breaking much more easily. Whereas in combat, these guys would charge straight at each other, and if you have an idea, as we were saying before, all those like 8,000 newtons concentrated on the tip of a lance, smashing into your chest, I mean, you're pretty much done for, right? Doesn't matter even if you have the strongest armor. I mean, the sheer impact that can happen at that speeds and force, it's something astonishing that it's often not taken into consideration. But it's something that can really smash away like a potato sack. That it's not even conceivable to resist. And consider that you have your own speed, your own mass accelerated, plus you have the enemy one coming exactly at your against you. So that, vectorially speaking, is double. Right, so you have something like 16,000 newtons impacting at that point, and it's wild, right? And that's what warfare actually was. And we have tended to say, cavalry, the romantic thing, it died with machine guns at the end of the 19th. Say, well, yeah, but that is still something that dominated. Technically, still exists out there, but the world went on for millennia with that, and that's very romantic and fascinating. Now, coming back to the Ellesmere Chaucer manuscript, well, we have this picture that is actually the cover that I used as thumbnail, so as a point of reference, that I inserted here, I don't know where, that shows in detail some gear of the horse. And one point to note are the brands on the neck and flank. Then the snaffle bit with extended branches, that is similar to a curb bit, which seems that, however, was not much in general use after the mid-14th century. Here were still present. Also the calkins on the rear hooves. Now, the latter were designed to keep the horse from slipping on soft ground, right? And in this sense, to even act as brakes proper, because you're in battle, you're men-at-arms, you're loaded in armor, and the horse is unstable in general. And if you are launched at full gallop and for any reason you have to stop abruptly, well, you may want your horse not to slip, to fall, because you're going to fall with him, and that's pretty damn bad. And so just for the sheer physical damage you would get from it, but simply because you are in the face of the enemy, and if you fall down, you're pretty much done for most of the times, at least certain situations. Not mention you could even fall under your own horse, which did happen. So this, because of the corsair that we said before, that was meant exactly also to run, so to take you away from trouble, as often as possible, and also perform more tactical feats in general. The brands are fascinating. Here we see basically an M, capital M on the left flank or thigh of the horse, and a equal Y, literally, on the neck, the left side of the neck. Now, this branding was customary in most countries in Europe at the time. It was a mean of identification in conjunction with a written record of the horse color, very often, and with these distinguishing marks, right, like flashes, white feet, and so on, plus the value, naturally, that was actually very important for all the system of the systems of replacement that gravitated around horses, and many privileges were attached to. To maintain these animals, there were lots of people working in the first place, just from the technical side, and the capital M in this instance is fairly certainly stands for the city of Milan, while the equal Y is very probably denoting a military unit, such as a company and or a squadron, also because there are two symbols together, and that was also pretty common. We've seen that these devices started appearing even in the other types of signalization, like on banners on the first, let's say, anachronistically speaking, uniforms. We've seen it in the videos about the armies of Charles of Burgundy in the second half of the 15th century, to reflect the broader articulation and specialization of tactics of military organization based on this ever more increased combined arms function. So when you look at these troops, you're seeing that the spearhead formation of an army, right? And contrarily wise to this commonly believed, especially by the year 1400, at the beginning of the 15th century, cavalry were still by far at the top, right? There is no, we have explained it many times, that there is no progressive linear increase of infantry strength between the 14th and the 15th century. It's a bit of an up and down, especially after the mid-14th century infantry had gone further down, and unless you look at certain exceptions, such as the English army, for example, that still was all mounted, because that is mounted, all men at arms and longbowmen, but normally it would be all mounted during the chevauchée, and that's for moving all together. So cavalry was dominating, and this is in many ways, of course, even the size of these horses was changing a big deal because of the increased offensive presented by firearms, crossbows, pikes, and that were of course meant by infantry, used by infantry, and that would change even certain aspects in the actual formation lineup, because these horses would become, a part of them would specialize, become horse archers, so lighter troops in general, so lighter horses as well. These heavier ones would be, for example, ever more occupying ever more space inside, right? Ever more distance inside, because the horses were beefier, and also their but by the 13th century, previously, there is this idea of the thickly packed formation during a charge, from which allegedly not even an apple, if you thrown in the middle, could fall on the ground, for how really muscle to muscle these horses and knights were for maintaining cohesion. By the 15th century, things are becoming too large a little bit, also because these horses are so heavy that they if they bounce against one another, it can cause more problems, because they're so bulky that they need more space between one another. So this also, it wasn't a dramatic difference at the end of the day in tactics, but it reveals how large these beasts were, how demanding they were, how the individual knight was becoming something incredibly more expansive than before, right? And in that sense, yes, with the rise of the Swiss in the mid-15th century, things would change, right, a lot. But for the rest, it would be normal to have this kind of traditions, and also chivalry would survive with this emphasis on the size, ever increased by the needs brought by ever more armor because of firearms until the mid-16th century, etc., etc. So, yes, there was a variety, but these heavier ones would become ever larger for that specific reason. They must make so much effort, they need to be more muscular, and there is no way to breed these larger beasts and selecting them for that specific purpose. This is pretty, let's say, pretty much it. I mean, there are beautiful examples of of these picture, the great horse, but I don't know, you can say them from the Bayeux tapestry, or I don't know, 15th, 16th century Italian or German artistry, sketches, things like that. Now, this video is naturally incomplete, and just wanted to point out certain aspects. Another thing we could actually say is how much these beasts actually costed in logistical terms. At some point we will have to make a video on the strategical mobility of cavalry proper, that is often overlooked, but that's 600 kilos de trait. Now, a horse eats 2.5% of its weight in various forages per day. So this means that the trait needed 15 kilos of food per day, of which 40%, that is 6 kilos, must be in grains. Talking about oats, barley, wheat. While the remaining 60%, it's 9 kilos, can be hay, or more than 3 times higher, about 30 kilos of grains or mowed grass. That has to be brought for the animal, because let's say horses can be fed grass only exceptionally, because this diet causes numerous gastrointestinal disorders to the animal, which, the selection of the breeds made by man had it much stronger, but also much more delicate in health in this regard. The horse is extremely resilient in many ways, but still it's very delicate in others. Only the steppe ponies could feed for long periods almost exclusively on grass, because they still had wild habits, and their metabolism was different. There is also those kilos have to consider a difference in weight between dry hay and still damp grass, right? And consider that a horse must also, most importantly, drink between 40 and 50 liters of water a day, depending on the work it does, naturally, but we're talking necessarily of pure and fresh water, because even in this case, only exceptionally could the animal be quenched with stagnant or non-pure water. And I don't know if you ever calculated the logistical needs of a medieval army. I mean, you even wonder how they actually made it to field so many troops at a time. Yeah, going against any possible and silly prejudice about the, roughness or primitiveness of medieval art of war, because they were dramatically more advanced in previous times, especially because of cavalry and this increased number and these massive amount of food and water. Speaking of the other typologies, we were talking before about the palfrey as the everyday ambler. This is how men-at-arms would essentially travel like, because these were, let's say, these horses had shorter legs, but they had longer body, so they, in order to travel, the middle part absorbed much better the shocks, and therefore it was more comfortable to travel on. As far as the courser was concerned, we forgot to say that usually they were horses with a certain temper, right? They usually had an odd one of Turkish, Arabian, or barbarian origin. In Europe at this time, the corsairs of the Kingdom of Naples were quite prized. The Neapolitans bought barber horses and bred them to European stocks. So this conferred actually some of the finest thing you could find there. I mean, royalty normally bought these Neapolitans, I don't know, as far as England. Then there were other typologies of horses, such as the Ronzi, the Ronson, that were like for initially, the beginning of cavalry, mostly for squires, etc. But also everything it depends on what you need at the specific moment, and that, however, presents you with a variety of mounts and all the market, the costs, the differentiation, etc. that this entails. And that's pretty much it. So we will talk about the evolution, in a sense, of breeds in this regard. Consider that the topic is very complex, because there are, like for humans, it's not you can spot actual races, right? There are just more similar stocks, but fundamentally also there were lots of differences that sometimes we don't even understand, because historically speaking, we're not dramatically documented. We don't have much remains, right? So it's important to even acquaint the sources with the proper expertise, etc. I personally don't have that, so I will naturally reference specialistic bibliography where we to go a bit more in depth these things. Anyhow, for now I stop here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.